Hey guys. All right, so we're going to go over the spinal nerves in this segment. We've talked about the nervous system, we talked about the central nervous system, the brain and spinal cord. So we finished up those. Now we're going to talk about the peripheral nervous system and talk about the motor neurons in the peripheral nervous system, the somatic and autonomic systems, and then the divisions of the autonomic system. We're going to go over that real quick, the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions. Then we're going to talk about the spinal nerves, connective tissue coverings that are over the spinal nerves, as well as the branches of the spinal nerves that are called rami. And then we'll talk about division of spinal nerves and the four spinal plexuses. Then we're going to talk about the major nerves that come from those plexuses, the cervical, brachial, lumbar, and sacral plexuses, and what they innervate. Then we're going to end up with talking about somatic reflexes and reflex arcs and reflex testing. And unfortunately, we can't do that in the lab, so I'll have to show you some videos. But anyway, okay, next slide. So here's the overview of the nervous system. So we have the nervous system is broken down into two parts, the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. So we have central, CNS, and the PNS. And the PNS is divided into sensory neurons, which are afferent. So those go back up to the brain and spinal cord, and then we have efferent, the motor neurons going out of the central nervous system. The motor neurons are divided into two segments, or two divisions, I guess. Somatic division and the autonomic division. So the somatic nervous system is voluntary, and so you have the efferent. These are consciously perceived things, and so these are moving your skeletal muscles. So these motor neurons go and innervate the skeletal muscle. So you see something, and then you see a glass of water, and you reach over and you pick it up to drink the glass of water. So those are all skeletal muscles. Then you have the autonomic, or think of it as the automatic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system are things that are not consciously perceived. And that's divided into sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions. The sympathetic division is the fight or flight system, and the parasympathetic division is the rest and digest system. And those act on the cardiac muscles, smooth muscles, and glands. Okay, the next slide is more complicated. I just want you to see this overview, then I'm going to show this in a little more detail. Okay, next slide. Okay, just like in the previous slide, this is just more words on this slide. So we have the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. So the central nervous system, the brain and spinal cord. Peripheral nervous system is the cranial nerves and spinal nerves. The central nervous system is your processing, integrating, and control center. Peripheral nervous system takes care of bringing sensory information in from the afferent division and sending output out the efferent division, the motor neurons. So you have the afferent division, which is the sensory receptors, ganglion neurons, that take sensory information to the central nervous system for processing. This sensory information can be from what's called the special senses, smell, taste, hearing, vision, balance, or somatic senses, things you feel with the skin, temperature, touch, pressure, vibration, pain, itch, tickle. Or it could be from things that you don't, that are lower level of the brain, things you don't consciously perceive. It could be your visceral senses from your organs, your viscera, things your body knows but you don't consciously know, like your heart rate, your respiration rate, your internal body temperature, your oxygen, your CO2 levels, your blood pH, all those things that your body knows is going on and knows what those levels are and how to maintain those, but you don't have to think about those. You don't have to think about how often to breathe. You don't have to think, oh, I need to take a breath, and then breathe. Your body just controls that for you. And then we talk about that in the medulla oblongata. So the efferent division of the peripheral nervous system sends motor output from the central nervous system to effectors. Now you have two divisions of that. You have the somatic division and you have the autonomic division. And the somatic division acts on things that you consciously perceive at the higher level of the brain. So it acts on the sensory information coming from your special senses, your nose, your eyes, your hearing, your vision, your balance, as well as things you feel, temperature, touch, pressure. Your autonomic system, you can think of as your automatic nervous system, is just on automatic. And those motor neurons act on sensory information received from your visceral senses and things your body knows but you don't consciously know. So your autonomic nervous system is also divided into two divisions, the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. So your somatic nervous system over here, it sends information down to the skeletal muscles. Okay, so it's your voluntary system, so you control those muscles, so you can move your fingers, you can move your hands around. Those are things I'm thinking about, not really thinking about moving my hands around, but I realize I'm moving my hands around, so I'm consciously perceiving that. The autonomic nervous system, I'm not consciously perceiving that my heart rate, I have no idea what my heart rate is. I have to measure that. I have no idea what my respiration rate is. I have to measure that, or my oxygen level in my blood. I can make some guesses because it's been measured before, but I don't consciously know what those things are. The autonomic nervous system, the motor neurons from that control what's called the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system is your excitement kind of system. It's the fight or flight, the emergency, the under stress system. It's supplied by something called the splanchnic nerves. These release neurotransmitters called catecholamines, which are epinephrine, adrenaline, and norepinephrine, which act on what are called adrenergic receptors. The parasympathetic division is a rest and digest system. It's for housekeeping. You're calm, you're relaxed. It's supplied by the vagus nerve. It releases neurotransmitter acetylcholine, which acts on what are called cholinergic receptors. And those are, two of them are muscarinic and nicotinic receptors. So think of nicotine, cigarettes, calming you down, those kind of things. So the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system both act on cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands. It's the involuntary system. Okay, so next slide. So your somatic nervous system is voluntary control up here. Your effectors are skeletal muscles. Your autonomic nervous system is involuntary control. Controlled by lower parts of the brain. Your effectors are smooth muscles, cardiac muscles, and glands. And you have the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions. So the things that sympathetic division does, it increases heart rate, contractility, bronchodilation, hepatic glycogenolysis, and glucose release. It increases your basal metabolic rate, increases muscular strength, causes sweaty palms. It decreases less immediately needed functions such as digestion and defecation and those kind of functions. Next slide. Parasympathetic division, meaning sympathetic, meaning in connection with or in sympathy with, in a sense. Parasympathetic meaning alongside the sympathetic system. It's really housekeeping. So your lack of stress, your rest and digest system, you conserve energy, you become calm and relaxed. It reduces your heart rate. Supplied by the vagus nerve, releases a neurotransmitter called acetylcholine. Stimulates GI secretions and motility, slows your heart rate, reduces blood pressure. So it acts on what's the acronym is SLUDD, salivation, lacrimation, urination, digestion, and defecation. So it increases those things and decreases heart rate and things that you might need if you're running away from a lion, say. Okay, next slide. Here's where the parasympathetic nerves and sympathetic nerves originate from. We're going to actually look at, in the diagrams, the sympathetic nerves. So here's your fight or flight system on the right side, and the nuclei, where the cell nuclei are found in these ganglia, are all down in this region from the thoracic nerves all through the lumbar nerves, so through T1 through about L2, L3 in that range. And those little ganglia are run right alongside the spinal cord. The parasympathetic system, the ganglia are up here in the medulla and down here in the sacral region. So you can see those. And so you see on the left side, the parasympathetic rest and digest system, constricting pupils, stimulating saliva, slowing the heart rate, constricting airways, stimulating the activity of the stomach, inhibiting release of glucose, stimulates the gallbladder, stimulates the intestines, contracts the bladder. On the right side, you have sympathetic nerves. You have the fight or flight system, dilating pupils, inhibiting salivation, increasing heart rate, relaxing airways, inhibiting the stomach activity, stimulating release of glucose, inhibits the gallbladder, inhibits the activity of the intestines, secretes epinephrine and norepinephrine, relaxes the bladder. So that's the difference in the sympathetic and parasympathetic systems. Next slide. One other thing to point out is the parasympathetic system. There's in both systems there's a preganglionic neuron and a postganglionic neuron. In the sympathetic system, we'll start on that side. The sympathetic system, the preganglionic neuron, the soma, the cell body, is located in the sympathetic ganglion, which is right next to the spinal column. And so those are all up and down all up and down the spinal column. We'll see those little bulbs in the next few diagrams. The parasympathetic division, the preganglionic neuron of the cell body, is in the brain stem, and then it has a long axon that reaches down to the target organ. And then there's a postganglionic neuron near the target organ with a short axon. In the sympathetic division, you have a short preganglionic neuron and a longer postganglionic neuron. So, all right, next slide. Okay, so on to spinal nerves. So what is a nerve? Well, a nerve is a group of axons outside the central nervous system. There's two types of nerves. There are cranial nerves, and those come off the brain, and there's spinal nerves, which come off the spinal cord. The spinal nerves, there are 31 pairs of them. We have 26 vertebrae in adults, but 31 pairs of nerves, and you have those. Remember, you have those. You have the vertebrae, and you have another vertebrae on top of it, and there's an intervertebral foramen on either side, so the nerves come out of there. So we got 31 pairs, but only got 26 vertebrae. So we're going to see how that works here shortly. So you have, and the spinal nerves are numbered very similar, same way as you number the vertebrae. So you have C1 through C8. There are 8 pairs. They come off the vertebrae, and they have T1 through T12, 12 pairs. Then you have L1 through L5, 5 pairs. Then S1 through S5, there's 5 pairs that come out of the sacral region, and they have the 1 pair coming out of the coccygeal region. And each spinal nerve contains thousands of axons, nerve fibers. Next slide. I'm going to talk about first how these, the coverings, just a reminder, this is going back a little bit, we talked about this in the intro of the nervous system, I think, is when we talked about that. So we have endoneurium, perineurium, and epineurium. So here's the endoneurium down here. On the bottom, it's wrapped. The endoneurium wraps around the axon. The perineurium wraps around the fascicle there, and the epineurium wraps around the entire nerve. So it wraps around a whole bundle of fascicles, and each fascicle is a bundle of axons, of myelinated axons, and each axon is wrapped around by the endoneurium. Those are all connective tissue coverings in the nerve. Okay, next slide. Here's a photomicrograph of a transverse section through a fascicle of a spinal nerve. So you have the perineurium. Oops, forgot what I was doing. Perineurium, and here you can see an axon, the dark dot right here, there, and then you have endoneurium around it. So there's endoneurium around it, and so this is showing endoneurium around there, and there's endoneurium around there, and endoneurium around here, and here's a nice one here, and that's the axon, and there's an axon, and there's an axon. Here's an axon, and here's the endoneurium around it. Okay, so, and the white area is the fat, the lipid. So that's shows up white in these light microscope images, and that's the myelin sheath that's around the axon. Okay, next slide. So spinal nerves, there are 31 pairs. They emerge from the intervertebral foramina on either side of the vertebral column, and they're named for the region from which they emerge: cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacral, and coccygeal. They connect to the spinal cord from a dorsal and a ventral root. So there are 2 roots of a spinal nerve, and so the spinal cord is here, and then you have a root come out and a root come out, and they come together into a spinal nerve. So we're going to look at a picture of that in a second. And spinal nerves are called mixed nerves because they have both sensory and motor axons. And we're going to learn that those dorsal and ventral roots, one of those is sensory and one of those is motor. And I'll tell you now, the dorsal one is the sensory and the ventral one is the motor one. So what you can see are, you have cervical nerves, there's 8 pairs of those. Thoracic nerves, you have 12 pairs. And then lumbar, you have 5 pairs. Sacral, you have 5 pairs. And coccygeal, you have 1 pair coming out. And I'm going to show a little bit better picture. There's this guy's just sitting here. There's also a few other nerves that points out sciatic nerve and ulnar nerve. But we're going to get into those and talk about what those do too. So, next slide. Okay, as I mentioned, spinal nerves are mixed nerves. There's a sensory nerve and a sensory portion and a motor portion. Sensory nerve you can think of as an on-ramp, afferent going up to the brain, and the motor nerve is an off-ramp going down out to the rest of the body. Spinal nerve is, in a lot of ways, not very long. Shortly after the foramina, it branches both anteriorly and posteriorly. These rami are called branches of the spinal nerves. There's a posterior or dorsal ramus, so it hits your back, and it innervates the skin and deep muscles of the back. The anterior ventral ramus supplies the muscle and skin of all 4 limbs and the anterior and lateral parts of your body. So if you feel something in your arm, that would be the anterior or ventral ramus of the spinal nerve. Meningeal branch serves the vertebrae, the vertebral ligaments, blood vessels, spinal cord, and the meninges, which are coverings over the spinal cord, as well as over the brain. And the rami communicantes, the connection, that's the sympathetic ganglion of the autonomic nervous system. And that's your sympathetic, your fight or flight system. And those come from those rami communicantes, those sympathetic ganglion are between the thoracic vertebrae 1 and lumbar vertebrae 2 to 3, somewhere in that level. All right, next slide. So the rami of the spinal nerves, what are they? Here we're looking down on top, so we're looking from a superior view on top of the thoracic vertebra here, and the so this is anterior here and posterior here. So this is your back, all right, and so those are your back muscles there, back muscles. So there's a little bit of muscle between those spinous process and transverse processes of the vertebrae. And you see these yellow is all the nerves. So you have some nerves, these yellow branches back here. These are nerves that are coming back and they are innervating those muscles in your back. So you have nerves. So those are on the posterior or dorsal side. So those are nerves on the dorsal side, and you see that this is a branch, those branch from here, there. So that would be a dorsal ramus there. Going off to the back. Then, so this larger one here, that is the ventral ramus. And it's going to head down and it curves back. The reason it's curving back at that point is that there's a rib that comes along. It's going, and those nerves go out and they follow along the rib to get to where they're going. So in the thoracic region, you have the major part of the spinal nerve, the branch, the ventral branch follows along each one of those, each one of your ribs. So you have a dorsal ramus, a ventral ramus. Then you have the rami communicantes. So you notice there's 2 of those coming off, and those come off about the same place where the branches for the dorsal and ventral ramus branch. And then you have this bulge here, so you have that bulging part there, and that is your dorsal root ganglion. Then you have a little, if you can see right there, there's another branch right there, and that's a meningeal branch there. So there's your meningeal branch of the spinal nerve. So you can see that you have the dorsal root ganglion. So this means that this right here, so find a place to write this. So this right here is the dorsal root, and this is the ventral root right there. Okay. So and here, so I have it labeled on this side. So we'll look back on the left side. We have the posterior or dorsal root is there, and the anterior or ventral root is there. And so you see those roots come off the the spinal cord, and the root comes off, and so the dorsal root and a ventral root, and they come together into the spinal nerve, which then immediately starts branching. And you have the meningeal branch, then you have the rami communicantes, as well as the ventral and the dorsal branches of the spinal nerve. You'll notice also that the branches come, these meningeal branches, they come and they innervate, and this yellow that's up here, which you can see there, that's the fat tissue, okay, and the webby stuff that you see in there, that's your arachnoid mater, and the little blue circles in there, those are the that you can see right here. There's a blue circle right there. Those are veins that are in the so all those are veins in and around the lipid, the fatty tissue that's all around the epidural space. And let's see if there's anything else I need to point out. So we have the anterior ventral root, the posterior dorsal ramus, the anterior ventral ramus. So you have the roots. So the roots come off the spinal cord and they come together into the spinal nerve, and then you have the branches that come off of the. So then you have the rami, or each ramus, and in between those two things is the spinal nerve. Okay, so you have the roots come off the spinal cord, come to into a spinal nerve, and they branch. They all these you have these different rami coming off of the spinal nerve. Okay, next slide. Here's what's called an anterolateral view of the vertebral column of the spinal cord. So you can see, here's our intervertebral foramen. So you see the spinal nerve right there coming out, and so the dorsal and ventral roots of the spinal nerve have joined to make the spinal nerve, and you have the dorsal root ganglion on the posterior side here. Then you have the dorsal ramus, the ventral ramus, this is dorsal ramus, the ventral ramus, and the sympathetic ganglion, and they have you can't see it there, so I'll draw it up here. Here's those two branches there called the rami communicantes. And then the bulge here is a ganglion. Remember, a ganglion is a collection of cell nuclei, and so that's the sympathetic ganglion. You can see these ganglion are going next to the vertebral column. So that's where all the sympathetic ganglion are. So they're just outside of the spinal cord, they're right next to it. And what actually happens is a motor neuron comes into here, and then synapses, and then it goes back out, and it goes out to wherever it's going to go. That's actually how that works for the sympathetic ganglion. But just remember that out of the spinal nerve, you have a posterior or dorsal ramus and an anterior or ventral ramus coming out of the spinal nerve. And then we're going to talk about where those ventral rami go to in a little bit. Okay, next slide. So, spinal nerve regions and the 4 spinal plexuses. So you have spinal nerves, there's 31 pairs, 8 cervical, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, 1 coccygeal. So that's all the spinal nerves there. Then you have what's called a plexus. A plexus is there's different plexuses in the body, different names. There are nerve plexuses as well as blood vessel plexuses. There's a network of anastomosing or interlacing blood vessels or nerves. And so we're going to talk about the nerve plexuses in this next little segment here. They're interwoven, so these nerve fibers come out, and then they join. Then there may be another nerve fiber that comes together and joins with it, and then it may split off again. So that's what anastomosing means: comes together and then it's splitting off again. The plexuses are a braided network. So you have and these are all from the anterior or ventral rami of the spinal nerves, and you have 4 plexuses that we're going to talk about: cervical, plexus, brachial plexus, lumbar plexus, and the sacral plexus. Note that that there is not a thoracic plexus. The spinal nerves T2 through T12 do not form a plexus. They follow they just follow the ribs around, and so there's no braided area, no anastomosis, so there's no plexus. All right, next slide. So here's where those plexuses are. Let's look at the so on the left side you have plexuses. Those are shown here, and so you can see this in this region. We'll look at the cervical plexus up here. You can see how those nerves come together, and then they leave each other again. Brachial plexus, you can see this makes this kind of mass, and then in the thoracic region, there's no plexus. Okay, those nerves, those ventral rami of the spinal nerves, just follow the ribs and go all the way around to the front of your body. Lumbar plexus, kind of see it in this in that region there, and then the sacral plexus down here at the bottom of the sacral region. Then we're going to look at the spinal nerves. So this is the actual nerve numbering here. So we have the nerves. You have the C1, C2, C3, C4, C5, C6, C7, and C8. So you have this numbering here is an old slide. Sorry, there's 8 cervical nerves. There's 12. This was a review sheet that I did. Sorry. So that's what these numbers are. Then we have 5 lumbar nerves, 5 sacral nerves, and 1 coccygeal nerve. Okay. So the cervical nerves, why are there 8 of them? Well, the first one comes out over the top. Second one comes out over the top of the transverse foramen. Okay, because you have remember this, the vertebra, the transverse processes. Sorry, transverse processes. Nerve comes out and goes right over the top, next to the transverse process, and just a little bit anterior to that. So C2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 all come out over the top, and C8 comes out below the transverse process in front of that, below the vertebra. So you have C1 through C8. So you have 8 cervical nerves. Then you have 12 thoracic nerves. So you have 8 cervical, 12 thoracic. Those follow each one of the thoracic vertebrae. And then you have 5 lumbar nerves, just like you have the 5 lumbar vertebrae. Then you have 1 sacral bone. It's a fusion of 5 bones. Well, that fusion of those 5 bones in that sacrum, it left those holes there, if you remember seeing those holes in the sacrum. So those sacral regions have a spinal nerve that exits through each one of those holes. So you have sacral nerve 1 through 5, so S1 through S5. And then the last one, you have the coccygeal, coccyx, and it's a fusion of 3, 4, maybe 5 bones, usually 3, 4 bones. And you have 1 nerve that exits out through the foramen right next to it. And then the yellow part that you see down here at the bottom, you may notice that little yellow bit down there. That's actually the filum terminal. That's the holding down the spinal cord down to the coccyx there, the pia mater extension. So there's your plexuses on the left and the nerves on the right. And we're going to do a little bit deeper dive in the next slide on this. So next slide. So the cervical plexus. So on spinal nerves on the right. Same thing, I'm just going to do the right and I'll do the left. So we have cervical nerves 1 through 8, thoracic nerves 1 through 12, lumbar nerves 1 through 5, sacral nerves 1 through 5, so it's S1 through S5, and then we have 1 coccygeal nerve, so CO1. On the left side, we have the plexuses. Okay, the cervical plexus is from nerves C1 through C5. Okay, and there's 1 nerve, and what I've listed underneath each of these plexuses are the nerves that I want you guys to know. So you have the phrenic nerve, which arises from the C3 through C5 nerves. Okay, the brachial plexus comes from the cervical nerve 5, 6, 7, 8, and the thoracic nerve number 1. So the brachial plexus has 5 nerves come out of it: musculocutaneous, axillary, radial, median, and ulnar nerves. The lumbar plexus comes out of the spinal nerves L1 through L4 and you have the femoral nerve and the obturator nerve. Then the sacral plexus comes from the lumbar spinal nerve L4, L5, and then sacral nerve 1, 2, 3, and 4. And you have the nerves that come out of that are the pudendal and the sciatic. And the sciatic is a combination of the tibial and the common fibular nerves. So tibial nerve and the common fibular nerve. The common fibular is also called the perineal nerve. Okay, next slide. So the nerves of the major plexuses from superior to inferior, there's more nerves than I described on that previous slide. The cervical plexus has several major nerves: lesser occipital, greater auricular, transverse cervical, the ansa cervicalis, supraclavicular, and the phrenic nerve. The phrenic nerve is the ones that are in bold are the ones I want you to know. So the phrenic nerve. Then the brachial plexus, I want you to know the 5 major nerves that come out of it: musculocutaneous, axillary, radial, median, and ulnar. The lumbar plexus has several nerves come out of it: the iliohypogastric, ilioinguinal, genitofemoral, lateral, femoral, cutaneous, and the femoral and the obturator. And the femoral and the obturator are the ones I want you to know. And then I want you to know the brachial plexus, those 5. And the sacral plexus has 6 nerves coming out of it: superior gluteal, inferior gluteal, posterior cutaneous. Then the ones I want you to know are the tibial, the fibular, or the perineal, and the pudendal. Then the coccygeal plexus has nerves that come from S4, S5, and the coccyx, and it contributes to the pudendal nerve. Most of it comes out of the sacral plexus. Okay, next slide. There's other nerve plexuses, just to remind you of this. You have the celiac plexus, Auerbach's plexus, Meissner's plexus, the pharyngeal plexus, the vagus nerves, cardiac plexus, pulmonary plexus, and there's other plexuses including superior and inferior hypogastric plexus, renal plexus, hepatic plexus, splenic plexus, gastric plexus, pancreatic plexus, testicular plexus, and ovarian plexus. So there's lots of plexuses out there. We're only going to talk about these 4: the cervical, the brachial, the lumbar, and the sacral plexuses. Okay, so if we're talking about the spinal nerve, if you get deep into the nervous system, you'll be learning about all of these different plexuses and where they are, and in anatomy. But for this anatomy 1, we're going to be just looking at the 4 major plexuses. I just wanted you to know that that these other plexuses exist, and that there are other things. You can always do a deeper dive into anatomy than we're doing here. And the word is also plexuses. It is not plexi. There are plexuses. Each one is a plexus. Okay, next slide. So major nerves from the cervical and the brachial plexuses. So the cervical plexus comes from you have the anterior ventral rami of the spinal nerve. So these are the motor portions of the spinal nerves. And so these are innervating things that, just to back up a second. So the nerves come out of the spinal cord and then they go somewhere, okay? They don't turn around and come back. They leave the spinal cord and they go and they innervate something else. So if I have a nerve come out of here, it's going to go down my shoulder or down my back. And if I have one lower down, it's going to go down, maybe innervate my arm. One down is going to innervate somewhere in my chest. So these start from a place and they go down and they innervate things that are distal to where they started from. Okay, so these, and then sensory information starts somewhere else and comes up to the spinal cord. It doesn't go part way up, turn around, come back, and go various directions. These things all basically go from the spinal cord and go out from there. So, okay, so the cervical plexus, the anterior ventral ramus, so it leaves the cervical region, C1 through C5, on both right and left sides of the spinal cord. And so you're supplying the scalp, the neck, shoulders, and a little bit of the chest, okay? So or quite a bit of the chest. The phrenic nerve is the main one coming out of the cervical plexus, I want you guys to know. It's composed of cervical nerves 3, 4, and 5. It innervates the diaphragm, which means it's extremely important for breathing. So the little saying is C3, 4, and 5, keep the diaphragm alive. You have 2 phrenic nerves, one on each side, and if you break your neck around C3, 4, 5. If you break your neck at C2, between C2 and C3, then you have interrupted the flow of neural activity down to C3, 4, and 5, and you will not be able to breathe because your diaphragm won't move. You'll end up with cardiac arrest. Respiratory arrest, then cardiac arrest. So, brachial plexus is formed also from anterior or the ventral rami of spinal nerves C5 through T1, and supplies the shoulders and upper limbs, and runs under the clavicle. Remember the collarbone. So, the major nerves out of the brachial plexus are musculocutaneous, and it innervates the anterior muscles of the arm. So if you're in anatomical position, so it's going to innervate the anterior muscles of the arm, mostly the upper arm. The axillary does your shoulder as well as the teres minor muscle. I'll show you those. And the radial does the backside of the arm, the posterior arm, and the backside of the backside of the arm and the backside of the forearm. Okay. The median nerve does the muscles of the anterior forearm. If I can hold this up in the middle. And the ulnar nerve does a lot of hand muscles as well as a couple of the muscles in the forearm. Okay, next slide. And so this is a repeat of the previous slide, basically. All right, next slide. So look at the cervical plexus. Here's what it actually looks like close up. So you have the nerves coming out here. So you have C1, C2, C3, C4, and C5. And so you see the branch. So here's a branch of C3. Here's a branch of C4. Okay, they come together and they travel down. All travels down to C5. And so C3, 4, and 5 keep the diaphragm alive. And those compose the phrenic nerve. There's a bunch of other nerves that come off here, but we're not going to talk about any of those nerves. I just wanted you to know about C3, 4, and 5. Those nerves come together. Branches of those nerves come together. You can see other branches go off and go other places as well. For instance, like C3 and 4 become the supraclavicular nerve. Okay, we're not worried about that in this class. All I want you to know is C3, 4, and 5. Parts of those come together to make the phrenic nerve. And then part of C5 branches off and goes to the brachial plexus. Okay, so part of it goes to the phrenic nerve, and part of C5 goes to the brachial plexus. But so just remember C3, 4, and 5. Parts of those nerves go to make up the phrenic nerve. Okay, next slide.